Okay, so we're gonna talk, and we're gonna really talk about a thing that's been worrying me, right? So I've been trying to understand um what exactly popular music is, right? And I think the concept becomes what is popular music, and I think to me, right? I'm not gonna limit myself to how long I talk, so this might be one of the longer episodes, and it might get a tad politically sound. And for that point alone, I'm not trying to make it political, but I do think it's an interesting topic to talk about. So I'm going to talk about it as I think I see it. Now, I am aware that some of these views are not going to line up with everybody or the mass majority. And I'm going to sound crazy to a mass majority of people. This isn't something that is going to sound beneficial to a lot of people, but it's very me esque. So, with that being said, I'm gonna kind of hop into it, and I'm gonna hop into this idea. So, this idea of what the 1980s is, right? And so, there are a lot of things that to me from the 1980s, and this could be a grass number of things. Reagan being in office, and and that political party, and then other things, that take the turn. There are also um, rap, music, hip hop, those sound the same. And I'm gonna break down why they don't sound the same to me, and I'm gonna also break down a few other things why I'm at this because to me, you have to be able to break a lot of things down, and to some extent, I don't think you can. I think you can't dumb them down too much, and that sounds probably like, hey, you're trying to reach an audience of a lot of people, so you do want to dumb certain things down so people can understand it. And okay, and I think I get that concept, right? So I'm not going to hold that against myself, but there are things, phrases, topics I'm gonna hold to myself because I think those are not values I agree with, but values that I think need to be understood. So my understanding or my concept of the 1980s may be a little shaded, solely because I think when you ask people and people say that 1980s is the was the best era, right? And I wonder what people consider the best era, right? Because theoretically, the 1980s, especially with music and popular music, at that, popular music itself was supposed to be a reflection of what the 1980s was. And I can't say with evidence on either side that the 1980s was what it claimed to be, or it wasn't what it claimed to be. And I think that's huge for me because I try to be as impartial to anything as possible. I don't try to have strong opinions on topics, and I don't necessarily, for that point, try to push a point or push a narrative or push an agenda. Now, previously, I think pushing agenda has meant a lot of different things to different people. So I do want to make that clear. But I do think I'm going to ramble a lot. So this might be like a longer episode. And it's solely because I think my interpretation of certain things takes a different perspective to look at. So with all that being said, they're like, well, what is this exactly about again? Because you lost me when you said different perspectives and you tried to be impartial and stuff like that. So basically, the 1980s and the culture and popular music that came along with it, right? And I think we talk about music into a different mindset of what exactly is popular music. And I think popular music in the 1980s is best described as music that the majority of people listen to, no matter if it's hip hop, rock, or the content that in itself created popular music. And I think to that standpoint, I think a lot can be argued. But solely if you ask me a music standpoint of how it affected the culture and how it affected the people, right? If you ask me those questions and you ask me where in the advancements that came with it, I run around with this answer that isn't necessarily a proven solution, right? But it is my interpretation of what the 1980s was. And please keep in mind that I was not born in the 1980s. I wasn't yet born in the 1980s. So this is from a perspective or of an outside view, right? And so with that being said, Ronald Reagan being in office, and people might say, what does that necessarily have to do with the advancements of technology, but also the standpoint of what the advancements of technology, and then basically what are those factors that played a role into the culture? I think the culture, and this is my standpoint, I think you get from a lot of different interpretations and different meanings. I think I'm hard pressed to lean one way or another on the 1980s. I can't say that is good. I can't say that is bad. I can't say that the technological advancements weren't great. I can't argue that they weren't great. I think at the time of the 1980s, there was a lot of moving pieces. For example, so so this is what I'm coming to, right? When I talk about the effects that played on the 1980s and the culture, I come back to the presidential side of things. And this is hard for me to understand, and this is hard for me to process the 1980s and their advancements if I don't talk about the presidents. And no, and I'm not trying to be biased in my opinion. Most of these don't really have like a side to them, a strong side to them at that. So they're more of just a general opinion. But in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan was trying to push the idea that, or I believe the idea that, as a society, everyone was doing good in the 1980s. And then my counter argument to that idea of, pushing or trying to explain the 1980s as everyone was doing great, right? We had the creation of color TVs. We have the concept of other things like technology being improved, and then 2001 comes. So there are a lot of things that lead up to the 1980s, but there are a lot of things that happen after the 1980s that also improve music for the standpoint. And I think this is argued. I think we argue what was a society, and Grandmaster Flash was a great example to me. I think we end up in this standpoint, and I think this is great. Him saying that, where he argued, well, Grandmaster, you had the music standpoint, but you had the presidential standpoint on the culture, like the culture itself. Music played a huge part in it because people wanted to have something that they could relate to, and everybody and then can listen to. This and the standpoint on that culture, I think strictly comes from the environment that people were living in. Not everybody was living up to this dream that the president was pushing out, where it was everyone was being successful. That wasn't true. We've seen that through Grandmaster Flash. We've seen this through other artists at the time, right? We've seen it over the times, and we've seen people go back to it and argue about the 1980s and that fame of it was successful. It was a booming business. But I think I argue with that because solely music itself was very diverse. For that simple point of popular music, it's popular for a reason. It had popular subjects that people wanted to listen to, right? But there were also things, and people were digging at the concept of policy that people believed were not right for them. So this concept of culture and these technological advancements. Yes, before the Walkman, on the culture side of things, people were, for a better lack of, they were listening to music as a group. You couldn't listen to music independently. So the concept, to me, that these advancements played, and where the Walkman, when you bought the Walkman, at the time it was $49 to $99 you could get it. In today's currency, it's $200 and some dollars, or maybe more. But at the time, the Walkman made it to where you could have a more personal connection with music, a solo personal connection with music. And to some extent, I think that, culturally, it wasn't the norm to not talk to people on the street. It wasn't. You talk to you talk to people, or my perception is you would always talk to people the old-fashioned way. Is, you always talk to people on the street, having headphones in your ear or paying attention to music and not talking to people wasn't something the 1980s had seen. So it argues the idea of what is real in the 1980s on the culture side of it. Was the music speaking the truth, or was the government line of hey, everyone's successful and everybody was popular, the real effects on this culture, right? And we have to take into account, and I think this is clear, but we have to take into account that not many people were doing great in the society. That's where you hear people say white collar, blue collar jobs, right? And most people, to a certain degree, did not have blue collar or white collar jobs. They were more labor intensive jobs, especially for the 1980s. So we have to take that into account. And to some extent, people will go, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that statement of everyone was successful in the 1980s is a bad argument. And I think this is my thing. Popular music at the time, it was less than 3% that were talking about social or political issues, right? But we also talk about the standpoint that many people, right? Because the common thing now, and in the years before, we have reports of the poverty rate that happened in the 1980s, right? So the poverty rate in the 1980s is undebatable culturally, right? Like culture wise, you had a lot of people coming from many different countries because it was a war. We had wars. Eisenhower during peacetime and D-Day, we had stuff happening, and so the culture, and this is the thing. Um, this is another thing that I think the presidential side of the effects it had on culture bother me, right? Because it bothers me because when we talk about culture, as a whole, we end up bringing up arguments and bringing up what is specifically culture. And I think at the time, Ronald Reagan is noted in one of his speeches saying that he hated rap. Now, the rap he was referring to was gangster rap. And when we talk about gangster rap, we get into the financials of what rap is and what rap was supposed to be over time. And that's another thing, and that'll be brought up in my next argument. But Ronald Reagan made a speech and said that he didn't want the Secretary of Education and Ronald Reagan himself said that they did not like rap. So with that public platform that the president always has, because all of his speeches are well known. That's why we have the inauguration, many budget speeches that the president gives every couple years, or the employment thing that we get every year from every president. Um, Ronald Reagan, he made a speech saying that he didn't like rap. So it made people listen to, okay, so why does this president not agree with the rap that is being mentioned? Why is he not agreeing with the rap? Right? So rap itself on a culture, people are gonna go listen because they want to know why a public figure or a historical public figure doesn't like this kind of rap. And I think that's where we run into the issue. While Ronald Reagan himself was taught, while Ronald Reagan and his director of education were talking about gangster rap, um, the context was rap and hip hop were one entity. They weren't necessarily split up as they are today, but Reagan broke it down into gangster rap, right? So gangster rap is best described as rap that, for some reason, is talking about violence or gang retaliation. Now we call it trap music now, or trap or hip hop now, but or drill music is another term that we use for this kind of music where they talk about crimes. And to some extent, we get that, but the issue that I have with saying that advancements that the 1980s was strongly, that I think that pushed that agenda of, hey, we need to listen to rap more because clearly the president doesn't like it, and people do the opposite effect of when you tell them what to do and what not to do. You end up making people, hey, let me go listen to this. As the president does, like, clearly it's a good music, or the theoretical idea of, oh, if the president doesn't like this, then there's for some reason because they're speaking truth or they're speaking volumes, right? Now, when you look at the original version of rap or rap over the years, and I'm gonna spend a lot of time on a rap. I, I am, and that's solely because rap gets a lot of attention, but we don't understand the difference between rap. So in the 1980s, we talk about rap, but we don't talk about the two sides of rap. And so when we talk about the two sides of rap, of course, gangster rap was made off of violence and illegal acts that people were committing. But the money of gangster rap originally was funded by mobsters. It was funded by it was really funded by the term gangsters or mobsters. It was really funded by that. And we people say, well, what does that mean? Because even today, music and but we focus on the 1980s real quick. So contrary to a lot of people's beliefs, I think gangster rap itself was funded by issues. Now the rap or hip hop as we'll refer to today, hip hop and rap are technically the same thing. Gangster rap is just another subgenre of hip hop or rap. And rap itself in the 1980s, the best way I can describe it is to bring awareness to issues that African Americans were facing. Now, some will argue that the crack epidemic is another thing that African Americans had to deal with. And to some extent, we could argue that that's what rap was talking about, the poor environments in the rap community when we talk about the bridges that so buses couldn't get through. But see, we talk about a lot of these issues. And so rap talked about the issues that a lot of people were facing. Now, this might be strictly focused on New York, since New York is considered the capital of hip hop, right? But these were issues that people were facing during the time. Now, they might not have been issues that everybody was facing, because granted, not everyone was facing huge issues or prosperity, like poverty as itself. A lot of people weren't facing those issues, but majority of people were. Not the American whole, but a decent amount. I think anything over 10% of poverty is a problem. But we talk about these issues, and poverty rates even higher now. But we talk about these issues, and people are like, "Well, I don't understand." The 1980s, the tagline for the 1980s, or the company line was, it was the year of success. Yeah, a lot of people got successful, especially in pop. We'll get to the argument of pop, but we talk about rap, right? A lot of people were going through issues, trash on the streets, which we could argue leads to New York's rap problem now. But there were a lot of issues. No way to get to buses, no ways to get to jobs, so people were walking. For example, the Martin Luther King boycott, right? Or the Missouri boycott. And to some extent, we get to that point, and people are like, well, that wasn't everybody. Yeah, but it was enough. Yeah, it was enough. The American Party line was, hey, we're doing great. Not everybody as a whole. And that's why rap came out. Right, but now to take this topic to more of a pop side, I think we argue that pop was a more successful and more uplifting song of music. And to some extent, I don't think I can deny that. But we have to talk about I think we have to talk about many of these situations that happened in the 1980s. I think we do. I don't think we can just justify certain things that happen. I don't think we can. Pop music as a whole, and I grant it to both of these guys that were men that were great at musicians, Michael Jackson and Prince. They were worldwide legends for the music they created, inspiring music. For example, Michael Jackson's Thriller, 1983, I believe, is when that album came out. Still impactful today. Billie Jean is really powerful, impactful, right? So many things in the 1980s. Michael Jackson, the Jackson 5, Prince, Purple Rain. There were so many things that made these guys megastars. And not to mention Madonna, but I don't know much about Madonna, right? So we argue with these issues of what was considered successful. A lot of pop stars made it successful. But Michael Jackson and Prince are the main two that everyone knows. You wanna know why? Because pop, they, and to some extent, pop was the more neutral, was the more neutral genre because they were talking about happiness, general happiness that the world could connect to. They weren't talking about the prosperities that they were facing in the 1980s, and they weren't talking about being rich. And that's solely because education wasn't pushed in the 1980s. It was pushed in 1990. 10 years later, it was. Education was a breaking point, right? Of we need to educate ourselves, right? Black Thought, for example. Right? Black Thought, you could argue Jay-Z, right? But we don't get to that point for a while. We don't get to that point of understanding it for a while, really. We get the creations of MTV, but MTV is still a little bit down the road. But pop wasn't that. Pop was uplifting. Hey, we're living in the moment, happy. Thriller's song Billie Jean, uplifting. Bad, lifting. Somebody just living their life, experience the pros and the bads of just life. It wasn't education focused. It wasn't. It just wasn't focused. It was more of, hey, we're just doing this to have fun and be creative, right? But then we have this discussion on jazz. And if you ask me, I think jazz in the culture, I think to me, personally, jazz had a lot of influence. I think, and I bring jazz up last because I think if you ask me, what do rap have in common? The roots of jazz. And jazz itself, if you ask me, jazz itself was a concept, and I read this somewhere, but it said that jazz was the fundamental need to make hip hop and rap, or gangster rap and hip hop, or EDP, or EDM. I'm sorry, EDM, right? They were standpoints. You wanna know why? Because without jazz, you have no emotion. Without jazz, you have no trumpets. And rap uses a lot of trumpets in the introductions. The guitars. Without guitars, what do we have in the 1980s? What do we have? Even today, what do we have without a guitar? Drums. No matter if they're beating drums or actual drums. Or tribal drums, for that matter. What do we have without that? And so for me to say that these advancements, either technical or just simple advancements, to argue that they didn't play a role in the culture and that the social political didn't play a role in the culture is to act as if I don't know history. And that bothers me when we talk about music, specifically because messages that were in music are phenomenal, and most of them are true. So to say that I don't know my history bothers me for a lot of reasons, really, a lot of reasons. But I think this is the standpoint that it's very hard for me to be, hey, this created this, this created this. In the 1980s, I just can't justify it. And so we're going to talk about these audio advancements, like the Walkman. Being able to record yourself and record a group of people with like a clip-on mic. We call them clip-on mics now, but they have a specific name. The ability to have headphones that go over your head. That was new in the 1980s. So it's very hard for me to go, hey, let's overlook those advancements. Let's overlook and look at the company line of the 1980s, that it was popular. I can't. Right? Because even with the culture belief, right? And I know I'm stuck on this culture belief, but it's very hard for me to stick on this culture belief when half of the stuff about the culture, no one talks about. To this day, I have not heard anybody talk about the 1980s and talk about the culture, political or social cultures that affected the audio advancements. Even if we go look at Moreland's Law, which Moreland's Law is simply the idea that they were trying to make cheaper electronics to they're trying to make smaller electronics on a cheaper scale. I haven't heard anybody talk about that. Now that does count as a technological advancement to me for audio. Now I don't know if everyone believes that, but I do, right? So that bothers me. But who am I to argue, right? I guess that's my thing. Who am I to argue strongly? Because I can't pick a side. I can't. I don't think I can make an argument that technological advancement played a huge role in the 1980s. But I know I can't argue that it didn't. Oh, it did. But so did the culture. But so did the fundamentals of pop culture. The condenser microphone. The idea of that in the aluminum coils. That played a role. But nobody would pay attention to that. The XL cables played a role in the 1990s. But we will talk about that. But the culture itself, I think we were coming into culture where drugs were an issue in the 1980s. So I think drugs played a culture in the music. I also think Miranda rights, that landmark case, played a role in the culture, and the culture played a role in the popular music that was being told. I think, from my knowledge, Ohio versus Terry, which is basically reasonable suspicion, an officer can check you, played a role in that. Now, Miranda rights in itself played a role in that too, but you have the right to remain silent if you do anything you say or do will be used against you in the court of law. Miranda rights. But that's part of the culture, if you ask me. The DEA, the Drug Agency Task Force, played a role in the 1980s because it was funded in 1976, a few years before, which we could argue played a big role. We could argue the FBI played a big role in it. The FBI was going after the mob, but we could argue and debate that for years. But culture is my problem. When someone says the 1980s was a great successful, is it really? Or was that the company line? So I guess that is my argument when people say, but the 1980s was great. Everyone was successful. That's not true. Everyone was living great. That's not true. There was some inflation. So to argue that, it was great. Great for who? Yeah, if you were making a livable wage in 1980, sure. A lot of people weren't. That's why social issues, education wasn't talked about. Right? Even I've heard a story that a school that somebody went to was $33,000 in 1989. And $30,000 was a lot of money in 1989. So the idea that culture and popular music and audio advancements didn't play a role in the 1980s is just a bizarre idea to me. I think because we go from presence to political to social, we go to MTV holding like there are things that we hold very, very much important to us now that just weren't things in the 1980s. Right? We're still dealing with Miranda and Terry versus Ohio for reasonable suspicion, and Miranda rights when you get pulled over and the officer has to read your rights. Like, we're still dealing with those issues. But to say that everyone was successful in the 1980s, I don't think that's true. Do I think the 1980s in itself and the audio advancement technology of being able to listen to it by yourself was an advancement? Yeah, I do. Because the idea of headphones and being able to relate to music more because you didn't have to listen to it in a group, so you could feel the personal connection to it, I think that played a huge part in it. Being able to record on the Walkman, I think that played a huge part in it as well. The idea that people had CD players because we are moving from more analog to digital. But CD players are still around. CD players are still around today. I have one. But I can't argue that any one different thing didn't affect the culture. I think to say that one thing affected the culture is to overlook many different things. And me personally, I can't do that because I truly think that that is the wrong idea to have on an idea of culture. Now, this isn't me getting righteous of picking a side on music or culture or technological advancements. Even the pop filter wasn't around in the 1980s. Right? So this is my thing. When you pick a side, you have to think of all aspects. They probably didn't have a pop filter, but they found a way around it to fix the audio. There were a lot of advancements. Even Benson. Even Benson versus Coca-Cola. I don't think Jay Benson was okay in that court case. I mean, he lost, but he didn't have enough evidence. So I don't think 1986 for him was great. I think he might have been sad, upset, frustrated, and that's rightly so because Coca-Cola is a big company. But to say the 1980s was great for everybody, to carry that company line, I don't think you can. I don't think righteously you can carry that line. Morally, maybe not either. But there are just issues with me, and I guess that's the thing. I try to play, for the most part, I try to play. I try to be neutral. And I say I could argue both sides, and to some extent, maybe I can't argue that they did play a negative effect or a positive effect. But can I? I don't think I can argue one thing played a role in the culture. I think a lot of things played a role in culture and popular music. But where do we stand on that? Like I think, and I seriously didn't mean to get political, but I do wonder because I think I have hot takes on a lot of different things, especially when it relates to music and cultures in America in the 1980s. But I think I don't know. I don't think I can justify it in 15 or so minutes. I don't think. As I said, this might be like one of those longer episodes because I don't think I can justify it in a short amount of time. I don't think I can. Now, I could be wrong, and you could be like, well, yeah, I could justify it in so-and-so phrases. I don't think I can. Because the sociology effect behind it of personality A and personality B and a group personality and a collective mindset of what the 1980s was. Yeah, sure, it had positive technology and advancements like MTV. But was it always positive? I don't think so. And I argue that to myself, but I don't know if want to disagree or agree with me. But I think overall, I think we can't. I personally cannot look at the 1980s and go, popular music. What is the problem? Tell me the problem and why these technological advances were good or bad. I could argue both sides, really. It caused people to be more closed off, which isn't a great idea. It caused people to find new music and keep their same music taste, and no one was exploring their music taste. Both sides of that argument, right? But the culture's part of it's very hard for me to argue one side or the other. Now, that is probably the hottest take you will hear me take this year. Granted, I don't have that many hot takes. But I think I righteously have the ability to stand on that argument that the 1980s wasn't great for everybody. Audio advancements, culture, or not. Some people just did not have it great. That's a hard line to carry that everyone had it great in the 1980s, culture wise. I don't think so, right? Because Miranda rights, yeah, that was great for some people. Cherry vs. Ohio wasn't. Because while people were listening to gangster music, people did gangster music stuff, and they still do it today. Now, we call it trap music and drill music with a different beat, with a different tempo, with a 102 beats per minute. Now it's probably 130. Yeah, that's changed beat per minute. But did the culture? I don't know. And this is probably a deeper discussion than it needs to be. I think that's genuinely what it's become. It's a deeper conversation. And I don't know if I can argue with that, the idea that it wasn't a deeper conversation. But that's just for me to discuss. I think many people will have other ideas or beliefs to discuss. I think people will have their own opinion, and I don't mean to push any listeners away, but I do wonder, what does one consider a great culture or a great idea? Because I would argue that there weren't any, but that's truly just my opinion. I don't think you can pick one side on the 1980s, because when we talk about it, we have cases that we have to talk about. That's just how I see it. Now I could be wrong. I could be completely wrong. People are like, well, this is why this is wrong. This is why this is wrong. The Walkman came out of this. The dental micro came out of this. But I think I gave a convincing reason why. Were my points solid? I'm not sure. But I will let her know what you take. Let me know.